Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for a New American Security, where we're talking to Dan Kliman, who until relatively recently was over in the Pentagon, a non-political appointee who served in the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. You are the Asia integration person. You're here now as a senior fellow in the Asia Pacific Security Program. And I should also tell our audience that you're a proud member of the U.S. Navy Reserve, serving as a Lieutenant JG. Dan, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Delighted to be here.
Dan, you're freshly out of government. You're over here at CNAS, very strong Asia-Pacific program. Pat Cronin being the person who's overseeing that. Talk to us a little bit about what you're trying to achieve here at CNAS.
Absolutely. So it's great to be here at CNAS, fantastic institution. I'm really looking to grapple with some of the challenges that I saw in government, but were quite difficult to address from that vantage point. One of them really is thinking about a geoeconomic strategy in Asia and beyond that I was always struck at DoD. The military side of what was then called the U.S. Rebalance was being implemented pretty rigorously. But other than TPP, which of course is now defunct, there was not a sort of similar thrust on the economic side. So I would say a geoeconomic strategy in Asia and beyond is one of the main areas I'd like to look at, particularly in light of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Another area that I'm very interested in focusing on is how do you use entrepreneurship to link together some of our key allies. I was involved a little bit with the Defense Innovation Initiative, the third offset, and I think defense innovation and entrepreneurship more generally is a real underutilized arm of American alliance engagement. So I'm very excited to hopefully move that forward here.
When it's a new administration, it's manning up. Some of the members of the team we both know would be excellent for this job. Mentioning no names in part because we don't want to jinx it for them, and they've been in the pipeline for a long time. But there looks like the jobs are being filled. What are some of the recommendations you have for the new administration, especially in the wake of the president's decision to back out of TPP? You know, TPP will continue. Obviously, that was a key economic leg of the U.S. strategy toward Asia, the last administrations. What are some of your policy recommendations for this new team as they get in place and start to implement and make their mark on the region post-TPP?
My top-line recommendation would be it's time to fix America's failed China policy. If you look on the military side, China is over time closing the gap between the People's Liberation Army, their military, and the U.S. military. At the same time, economically, they've potentially, on some measures, overtaken us in terms of gross domestic product, and also are closing the innovation gap through even acquiring U.S. companies and investing in Silicon Valley startups. And so, to me, we had this policy failure that multiple presidents have presided over. It's not a single administration by any means, but there's really no better time than now to actually address it. And hopefully, with the energy of new people coming in, this is the moment to strike.
And what do you think is a failed policy, and what does a successful policy look like? Because there are those folks who have a slightly more hawkish version of China, a view of China that would say that this view of looking at China as a backward nation that always needed our help and would never catch up to us was actually the error we made over the decades, thereby helping create economically and otherwise this peer competitor we now face. What's broken about the policy that we've had over the past decades in your view, and what is the right strategy going forward?
A successful policy would openly acknowledge the reality of competition while also seeking opportunities for cooperation. This would really start with prioritizing China as a leading competitor, that instead of treating China potentially as one of multiple security concerns or as kind of a long-term challenge but not the pressing issue, really from the president on down, setting the tone that this is a competition that's underway today and we need to take it seriously. So that's one piece. I would say that the second element would be not outsourcing competition with China to the Defense Department. Ultimately, DoD is one piece of a response, but economic agencies and departments have a key role to play. And to me, that was an area where they've been underutilized, but potentially could bring more flexible and potentially more helpful policy options to the table. So that is a second element. The third is the need to build in from the front cooperation with our key allies and partners. That U.S. allies and partners have distinct views on China, and any new approach to China the U.S. develops has to take their perspectives into account to succeed. So it's really having a dialogue with them up front rather than developing something in isolation.
But you mentioned that you thought that U.S.-China policy had been a failure. Where do you regard it as a failure? Where did it go wrong? When did it go wrong? And how did it go wrong from your standpoint?
Sure. So starting with the military side, China has built up its military since the 1990s, in part responding to what they saw as U.S. primacy coming out of the Gulf War, and has had a very long-term systematic military modernization focused on chipping away at U.S. military advantage. The United States has very understandably been focused on fighting, yes, large land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but what that has meant is there has been less bandwidth and focus on the need to maintain a military advantage vis-a-vis China, a very different competitor than, let's say, terrorists or kind of other less capable states. So on the military side, you've seen this gap begin to close, which is very worrisome. On the economic side, there's a few areas where you could describe it as a failed approach. And again, this is multiple administrations have presided over large and growing trade deficits with China that have cost over time millions of U.S. jobs. You've also seen, and the president has talked about this recently, intellectual property, whether it's theft or acquiring U.S. technology through legal means. But again, essentially China beginning to siphon away some of the crown jewels of American innovation, which the intellectual property issue at least has cost potentially up to $600 billion a year is the highest estimate that has been put forward. But that's an enormous 3% of GDP, so a very large cost. So on the economic side and the military side, I would say you see both areas where there's been failures.
And you mentioned in the beginning the rebalance. That was something that was lauded by some, criticized by some who were in the department at the time and in the administration about how it wasn't fully trickling down. In some cases, it was not adequately resourced. You were there at the time that this was going on. What about it did you think was successful? What about it did you think was unsuccessful and needed its own rebalance or refocus to try to fix?
Absolutely. So on the military side, I would say the rebalance was generally a success, that you saw real changes in U.S. force posture in the Asia-Pacific, a real push to strengthen U.S. alliances and partnerships from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia and India. So there was a very kind of serious and sustained push on the military side. The economic side is where it's a different story. Of course, TPP was kind of the cornerstone of the economic approach. Ultimately didn't happen under Obama and then was then terminated by this administration. And beyond TPP, there was never kind of other major economic initiatives that were coming down the pipeline. And ultimately in Asia, the military matters a great deal, but you have to have an economic policy in Asia. That's what these countries are ultimately focused on. And so in that sense, that was a kind of key deficiency with the rebalance and a key question for this administration, which is, if not TPP, then what? How do you have a successful Asia policy that has both a military but also an economic component as well?
And what does that look like from your standpoint, especially in the post-TPP era? You talked about a little bit of the economic engagement you'd like to see, but what does the broader regional U.S. strategy have to be that looks at China as a key component of it, but not the exclusive component of it?
Focusing on the geoeconomic side, one, this administration could decide to support the efforts by the remaining members of TPP to conclude a trade pact, even without the United States. So quiet support for that. It would still be a significant achievement, would mean that a large number of U.S. allies and partners are coming together. If they retain the kind of what was the TPP text, a fairly robust, kind of high-value, high-quality trade agreement. So that would be kind of one initial element. A second, more ambitiously, would be working with U.S. allies and partners to come up with a strategic response to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and to want to understand where there are opportunities to cooperate, since certainly many of these countries where China is investing in Central Asia or the Indian Ocean Rim need that investment desperately, and coming up with ways to cooperate with China where the United States and its allies and partners can, but also to understand where China may be using its economic access to then exert political pressure and trying to counter that and give countries essentially multiple options rather than have to essentially accede to Chinese pressure. A final element of a geoeconomic or economic approach would be leveraging entrepreneurship more, and that links into the security side. So, for example, one of the programs that was really fantastic when I was at DoD was Hacking for Defense, essentially taking students, giving them a really hard defense challenge, and coming up with really creative solutions. you could do that with our Asian allies as well, taking some of the operational challenges they face and leveraging entrepreneurship to actually solve, both on the economic side, but even on the defense side, some of their challenges.
And let me ask you about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That was controversial. The Obama administration tried to stop its closest allies from participating in it. It ultimately didn't work, as everybody subscribed to that. Is there a U.S. role or U.S. participation or U.S. interaction that can happen with that? Or is that a circumstance where the United States should have actually put more leadership and more money on the table to basically offer everybody an alternative to that financial instrument, which China is looking at, Beijing is looking at, as a wide assortment of tools to sort of undermine sort of the U.S.-led rules-based order with its own substitutions to World Bank or International Monetary Fund or what have you?
There might have been an early opportunity to try to revitalize the Asia Development Bank, which could perform potentially a similar function to AIIB. Obviously that opportunity was not taken. To me, the main lesson of AIIB is that if the United States wants China to take more of a leadership role, it will build some of these types of institutions, and it's about holding them to a global standard and not trying to sort of force choices, our countries with the United States or against it. To me, it's a very much cautionary tale with the Belt and Road Initiative that the United States needs to have a strategy that's smart, that's nuanced, that identifies where there are opportunities to cooperate and also where we need to compete, and doesn't ask allies and partners to essentially try to side against it or for it overwhelmingly.
Dan, thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate it and look forward to having a continuing dialogue with you.
My pleasure. Great to meet you.